Hello everybody, this is Willem Windblown. In my last video I did the underpainting for this painting, and in this video I'm going to be doing the first layer of color. Really need to think of some type of clever transition for that sort of thing, but I'm still just figuring things out. This is a pretty new thing for me, putting commentary over my painting. I'm used to just painting. So what I'm working right now, it's at 400% speed. I'm doing this because I think it's important that if you so desire to, you can go into the YouTube little settings and make it down to the actual speed I'm working at, so you can get an idea of just how slow the process of painting is right now. You can see what I'm doing on here as I'm putting on my protective plastic gloves. These are the same plastic gloves I used last time, and I found I can get through basically an entire painting on a single set of gloves. I think it's kind of important to try to minimize the amount of waste that you produce for painting, just because it's really easy to make art making a really wasteful process, and try to help the environment where you can. It's also, with the pandemic, a PPE shortage, so if I can minimize the amount of gloves I use, I think that will help a lot. You can see what I'm doing right now. I work on disposable palettes, and I found instead of buying those expensive disposable palettes from Blick, if you just use wax paper and put 2 sheets down and work pretty lightly on top of it, you can get a really nice kind of disposable wax paper surface. What I just started doing here is a process that I learned called oiling out. And basically what this does is it primes your canvas so that it's a lot easier to paint into it than if you were to painting into it dry. I put a mixture of 50% linseed oil and 50% Gamsol in that little bottle, and then you give it a good shake and put it on a paper towel and smear it around. I found that the painting, it's a lot easier to paint into a painting that is wet versus one that is dry. When you're painting into a dry, it just kind of feels like the paint is scraping across it, but when you have that thin little layer of oil on top of your canvas, the paint really glides much easier and it's much smoother, so it's much nicer to paint on. I'm getting started setting up my painting now. I work from a limited palette. This is something that's pretty standard amongst painters that have an academic background. Generally, it's a comparison as limited palette versus an open palette. And really the only difference in the meaning is that open palette means that you don't have a set amount of colors that you work with, where limited palette, you do have a set amount of colors that you work with, and you try to restrict the amount of different paints and pigments that you're introducing to your painting. I used to put a lot of value into this thing called pigment harmony, which is basically trying to use as little different types of pigment as possible in a painting. But now I just kind of think that it's as important to just kind of really intimately understand the pigments and the paints that you're working with so that you can use them as best as possible. So I, a second ago, showed the colors that I'm working with. The colors I'm working with for this painting are Hansa Yellow, Cobalt Teal, Alizarin Crimson, Raw Umber, and Ultramarine Blue, and Ivory Black. This is kind of a pretty standard palette. I usually don't have that ultramarine blue in a palette. I much prefer like one of the cyanide blues. I usually like Prussian blue, but I ran out of that, and I'm trying to kind of go through all the paints in my paint box so I can kind of understand the paints that I have better and to just try new things out. So what I'm working on now is I'm blending out the colors on my palette. When I first started, I was really into brush blending, where you basically do all of your blending with your knife as opposed to blending out with a palette knife. And I found if you blend out with a palette knife more, you develop these things that are called mother colors. And these are basically kind of unified tones that it allows you to kind of work from, and kind of you can definitely do little variations on these mother colors, but having these mother colors helps you kind of focus around your palette, so you have things that are more distinct and kind of less averages of all your colors put together. So it's mostly a preference thing, but from listening to a lot of professional artists talk about this thing, most painters are in favor of blending out their colors with a palette knife before they start painting. So I think it's not a bad habit to develop. Something I like also when I'm doing this is it allows you to really plan out the colors that you're going to be working on, because when I first set out a painting, it's kind of intimidating just looking at everything and just being overwhelmed with all the different possibilities of what you can do. So I found if you take the time to really blend out your colors and to just get started working, it kind of helps you take that first step. And it helps things kind of get moving. So it took me about 20 minutes to get through all this blending, just looking at the painting, figuring out. And I'm like to be very thorough with what I'm blending. I just showed what the mother colors were. So I think that means I'm about ready to get blending. So I'm getting out my trusty brush. This is a knife brush that I discovered fairly recently after watching a YouTube video. And I've recently just kind of fallen in love with this brush. I'm laying down a turquoise blue into the trees here. It's not like a full turquoise blue. It's kind of like a dark green turquoise blue, but I really like the way that the kind of cold blue looks on top of that warm underpainting. It really gives a nice contrast. So it might not be exactly the color I want to finish off with for the end of the painting, but right now it just is so beautiful having those kind of little bits and inconsistencies in the brushwork kind of peeking through that blue, which I really, really enjoy. So as I'm laying down colors, I'm trying to get my block in to be relatively geometric. I'm not focusing on the details or the textures. I'm mostly just focusing on trying to get the angles to be as specific as possible. I found that the more specific these angles are and kind of the more sensitive I am to these angles, the less generalized the painting looks. And I found that when a painting doesn't look generalized and it looks specific, it kind of looks a lot more like it is the scene in real life. Whereas as opposed to kind of trying to go for all the details and get the details to be perfect. So it's kind of interesting when you're painting, you're going for kind of this underlying color and this underlying kind of geometry of a landscape, which is something I've always found very interesting about painting these types of things, is that your kind of mind is on another layer below kind of the surface level details, and you're really trying to closely observe the angles and where things are supposed to go. So now I'm moving into that other tree. You can see here I just laid down a curve, which is something that I am pretty hesitant to do in paintings. I found that you can much more easily lay down lines accurately than in a curve you can lay down accurately. So it's a little bit unusual for me to do that sort of thing. But I mean, it didn't seem like a particularly difficult curve, and it's probably not correct for the context of painting the image, but it's something I wanted to get that curve in there, just to kind of have it as a place marker. You can see I was kind of making a value correction, or not a value correction, a form correction, by kind of smudging it with the brush. And I try to, or the paper towel, and I try to avoid using Gamsol or anything like that in this early of a stage, just because I've tried to keep the painting just with that layer of oil down there and just working and pushing the paint around. And as you paint, you'll get pretty comfortable with having things not be correct and kind of being in the wrong place. And you just kind of keep in the back of your mind that things are going to be getting better. And right now they might not be perfect, but eventually they will kind of get better. So I'm just building up these trees. I'm focusing on kind of trying to get the trees to feel as voluminous as possible. And I'm trying to avoid tunnel vision. Unfortunately, with the quality of the video, you can't really see the different color variations. Right now, you can only really see the value, but I'm trying to slightly work in some color variations here. I find that it's good to break up those shadow shapes. A painter once told me that if you get two colors in a shadow, that shadow will look realistic. So I don't know if it's a hard and fast rule that if you add two colors to a shadow, it will look like something that's from real life, but I just like to break up those shadows. I don't want to have a single tone. So now I'm starting to key in the lights, and this is another moment where I'm thinking to myself just how much I really love that knife brush. It has a broad, like the broad of it is kind of the flat of the blade does a really good job laying down paint. And then you can kind of turn the brush around or hit the canvas at a different angle with the brush, and it will give you really, really nice textures and details. So it's kind of like a 2-in-1 brush, which for a painter like myself who doesn't really like changing brushes that much, which is a bad habit, which I wouldn't encourage. But anyways, it is a really great like kind of 2-in-1 type of thing. In this area that I'm working in right now, there's a bunch of houses beyond the trees, which I didn't really go for in this layer. I'm not really entirely sure if I want these houses to be in the composition or not, because they are kind of distracting from the subject matter a little bit, which at this point I've decided the subject is that little trailer, the woodpile, and the boat, and the patio. And a big part of the narrative of this landscape that I'm going for is kind of hopes and dreams and kind of development. And the fact that the houses are really on top of each other in this landscape is kind of a part of the character of the landscape. But I'm not sure if it's really something that I'm interested in painting in this composition. Just because, again, at least my idea right now is that it's about these kind of forms that are in the foreground and the middle ground. So I don't know if I want to have the background too detailed where it's going to be distracting from things. But again, though, I do really think that an important narrative that needs to be discussed in art is overdevelopment, which isn't really addressed that often, which I think is kind of interesting. You see it a little bit in like urban context where you have these kind of dystopian cities where people are on top of each other and stuff like that. But they don't talk about the suburbs and the infrastructure in these types of areas and how there's just more people and more things than can possibly be accommodated in the landscape. Here you can see I've been kind of using the tip of that knife brush to kind of work in some tree details. And I right now, prior to this, had a bunch of flat shapes in those shadows. So just by doing this, it's kind of break things up and make them feel a little more organic, less kind of mechanically placed down. And that will just kind of it's not like just softening up those shapes, but it's going to optically soften up the shapes by just adding a little bit of texture to them right now. I don't want to go crazy with the texture, but I also don't want to kind of have them be totally flat, perfect shapes, because I found it's really hard to, in those final layers, build up those textures and make something look organic if it's just being placed on top of something which is totally flat and perfect. So I found if you just have layers and layers of these soft meshes of textures built on top of each other in those final layers, that kind of basically you've already done all the work and you just need to modify the values and selectively sharpen a couple things, maybe add a couple leaves just to let your eye kind of optically fill that space. Which is something that is interesting with painting. If you have that kind of soft network of textures, it only takes a couple little leaves or some real kind of detailed explanation of what that texture is supposed to be, and your eye will do the rest of the work filling things out. It's something to keep in mind, though, that it's important is you don't want to really overmodel these things. You don't want to get tunnel vision this early on in the painting, because painting is something it's based on relationships. And if you get one part in one value and like you get one part all finished, then it might get thrown off, or it might never look correct if you don't get the things around it placed in. So it's something important not to get tunnel vision. I've moved on to the other side of that tree, which is dividing the canvas. And I was really scared when working on this because a big partition in that tree there could make it look like it's two different trees. So I was really careful to try to get those colors matched as closely as possible, which is a little bit troubling to do because I also need to, in that tree over there, get it to look like it's being close to that light, which is going to be filtering through the composition. So there needs to be a slight temperature change and like different highlights than on the other tree, just because it is approaching the light. But I also don't want it to feel like a different tree. So I'm going back in kind of with that same color to try to build out the volume of the tree, and I'm hoping that that's going to help unify the half to that left of that giant trunk and then the half to the right of the giant trunk. And again, this is why I think it's important to avoid tunnel vision is I spent a lot of time with the texture in that area over there, but then I needed to make a value correction on it, and I ended up painting out all that detail and that I had previously worked in. So it's important to kind of find a balance. I think an important thing is you don't want to be just too committed to the types of things you lay on early in the painting. And now I'm trying to get a little bit of light at the top of that tree to filter through, kind of peek through. And one thing that you can do if you're trying to make things look lighter is actually darkening next to where the light is will make things look lighter. And again, this is going back to that idea of tunnel vision. I remember when I was doing portraits, I would try to make a thing lighter, and I would be practically laying down just pure white paint, and I could never get it light enough. And one of the lessons I learned is sometimes the way to make some things lighter is to darken the things around it. So by increasing the contrast in the dark, you can actually make things appear to be lighter. Which is why I usually have a habit of starting with the darks of a painting and then adding in the whites in the lights. That's also because I find that darker colors tend to feel, at least when you're working with them, to feel a lot thinner. And thin paints are really easy to push around and really easy to move, and they handle on the brush really nicely. Where the titanium white or lead white or zinc white, well, not really zinc white, zinc white's pretty thin, but titanium white's a pretty thick color and it doesn't really like to move very much. So when you lay down those lights, you really don't want to move them too much. You can see I just put down that kind of big section of light kind of in here. I'm really happy with that solid color that went in there. And there's this really nice effect I'm getting right now where there's this kind of cold teal light color in there. And one of the colors on my palette is a cobalt teal. So that's a really pigmented teal. So it's very light and it's also very colorful, which is why I like that cobalt teal so much, is it's just a really dense pigmented paint. So you can make it really bright and it still will retain that nice cold color. For like a more traditional approach from a grisaille, you shouldn't be using titanium white. You should actually be using lead white. And lead white I found is really great when I'm working with figures because it gives this like beautiful purple when you paint on top of like an ivory black or a raw umber. And it gives kind of that transparent effect of flesh, which is really beautiful in paintings. But it's not really what I'm going for here. So I figured it wouldn't be such a big thing to use the titanium white. I also know plenty of figure painters who use titanium white and they swear by titanium white. I think it's just a matter of what you learn with. I also find that titanium white's just a good paint for building up paint really quickly, where lead white's a little bit slower because it's much less thick and it blends a lot more. So if I wanted to kind of transition this into a more like developed underpainting, then I would start introducing the lead white, which then the progress of the painting would be that I would start glazing on top of that lead white versus the more direct approach that I'm taking. It's kind of interesting. The way I used to paint trees, I wouldn't soften anything at all. This kind of gave the effect, it looked like kind of like the trees were like a little bit like they're looking like right now, where I would think they look like razor blades with those really sharp edges, which in a way is pretty cool. I used to do like these landscapes where all the trees were really crazy sharp. I think it was because at that time I was doing lots of engraving. So when you're carving metal and working with like a razor sharp piece of steel, then carving copper, which gives these like burrs that are super sharp and will tear you, like everything feels kind of sharp. So you want to make the image pretty sharp just instinctively. And that kind of got translated into my painting, which I thought it looked cool, but I had a critique with a painter, which I really deeply respect. And one of the points he brought out was that these razor sharp trees are kind of distracting from what my composition was. And the conversation turned into what my idea for the landscape is and where I wanted the eye to go and what I wanted the landscape to do. And having these razor sharp kind of explosive looking trees, while they looked cool, they weren't really doing much for the general composition. They weren't really doing much for the landscape. So I've kind of moved away from those kind of explosive razor-like trees or geometric abstraction trees just because I've very, very rarely come into a landscape where the thing that is really beautiful or the story I'm trying to tell is like just the general shape of the trees. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not the story I'm trying to tell right now. I've kind of been going on about this idea of development and kind of what people's like kind of hopes for landscapes are and how people interact with the landscapes. And at least in the general context of what this is right now, those trees are, if anything, kind of afterthoughts in terms of what I'm trying to do, in terms of what I'm trying to develop. So looking at that kind of blue-green color right now, it's a very pretty color, and it is technically realistic. But one thing I'm not sure looking at this, and I need to go back to the actual site to do color studies again, is I'm not sure how probable the color is. And that's an interesting kind of concept in realism, which I think about a lot, is there's a difference between kind of reality and like what is realistic and as it is in the world and as it is in a painting. And that like you can have these perfectly realistic scenes, but the probability of that scene actually existing in the world is so incredibly improbable that I almost feel like it's kind of betraying the truth of the landscape. So I like to try to keep my landscapes looking like being realistic, but also being probable, and that it's something that if you were to go onto the site, you could experience yourself. And that's not to say that like you're trying to go for that kind of perfect moment where the sun is perfectly kind of peeking through the trees and lighting up the grass in a certain way where everything looks very aesthetic and very nice. But I like to just kind of have everything be within the realm of probability, where if you were to actually experience it there and trying to translate this moment, it's something that you could experience in real life. Now I'm working in those tree trunks and laying in that shadow shape there. Again, I'm just trying to keep things flat right now. And I'm doing that just because right now they're just shapes. They're not trees yet. And eventually I find that in the beginning of the painting, when you're pushing things around, you don't want to overcommit to details and that sort of thing. Because if you do that, then you might have to move it, and you spend all this time kind of getting this really nice looking tree trunk, and then you discover that your tree trunk's in the wrong place, which is actually something that's going to happen later in this painting, is I'm going to have to make some adjustments because I found that I wasn't working in the place that I would want to be working in. And that's again another advantage of keeping things soft, is you can just lay down color straight on top of a soft shape, and you're not going to really need to make any serious corrections when fight it. It's just going to very easily adjust. This is the area that I was just working right now, where I'm going to have to work in later to just kind of do some corrections. And I'm starting to kind of move into that fence back there, which is a little bit tricky to work on because that tree there is pretty dark because it's being silhouetted by the light that's going to be filtering through. And that fence is also has light that's going to be filtering through it. So I'm kind of just at this point thinking about how I'm going to kind of solve that little problem there. Because if you put two dark shapes on top of each other, it's not going to really put very much visual contrast or kind of spatially sort. And so I need to figure out what I'm going to do about that. So at first I'm kind of starting to work it in. You can see I've already made it lighter than the tree. At the photograph, this area was black, but I've learned to never really trust the shadows in a photograph because they always make things a bit too dark. So here I'm laying it in a little bit dark, and you can see that edge near that tree that I wanted to be contrast. I made it pretty light, and I'm going to kind of very tentatively and slowly be working it over. And as I was working on this, it dawned on me that if the morning was particularly misty, which is something that is probable, there's plenty of misty mornings around here, then that kind of light that's filtering through that tree there would kind of get pulled through that kind of area and kind of light up that fence a little bit. Even though it's getting silhouetted, it kind of, when you see those like Hudson River School paintings, they have that like kind of optical illusion where it's the light being cast through the water vapor, and that kind of will light up a dark shadow like that. So it's not something I'm going to make an adjustment yet, but it's something I'm going to go for eventually. Now I'm kind of taking one of those blending breaks again, where I'm basically stopping, collecting myself, blending out a new color for a tree. Previously, by this point, when I was much younger, I would just go straight into, once I've gotten through that first color palette and I'm done with that area, then I would just do brush blending for the rest of it. And I found that it's pretty hard to make a different element in the painting feel distinct if you're using the exact same mother colors and just kind of brush blending and squeaking by as the background. So I'm taking the time blending out a new palette so that when I go into that tree, it's going to feel more distinct from its surroundings. Usually my trees, I don't really try too hard on trees ever. Again, I've never really found a tree that I want to be the subject of my painting. Of course, I just did a painting where the subject of my painting was just like the trunk of a tree, which had a really interesting angle for it. So it's not entirely true me saying this, but I generally try to I like to say that I like to keep my trees lazy and very purple. And I like the purple because I like the way the purple looks when it's against the green. It's a nice kind of contrasting color in there. So you can have something that's a similar value to its surroundings, but it's going to kind of stand out and be distinct from that kind of sea of green. So I like to try to emphasize the purple in a tree. And I try to avoid the detail in a tree. You can see here I'm working in the highlights, and I'm actually going to detail a little bit more by this point in the painting session. I'm just kind of operating on autopilot, and like I said, I just completed a painting where I was kind of modeling the bark of the tree and stuff like that a little bit. So I am kind of operating on autopilot. So all this work I'm doing right now is basically going to be softened out and erased later on, but it's a lesson learned, I guess. So I mean, it didn't take much time, and just because I had just painted a tree very recently, I was very familiar with how to do this type of thing. So I'm gonna eventually get rid of it, but yeah, at least it's the correct value and all that kind of stuff. So softening out wasn't a total loss. And then I'm working into that dangerous area back here. This is an area that I was actually surprisingly gonna struggle with a bit, where I'm gonna be pushing and pulling that area. So yeah, I'm a little bit surprised about how tricky this little like kind of afterthought section was back here. But I think that's kind of the areas of the painting that are pretty tricky, is those like little areas where they need to be like very soft transitions, because those transitions can, if you don't do them correctly, they can really distract from what your subjects are supposed to be and like all the work that you're going to be putting in front of it. So looking over this right now, it's a little bit dark. And here I'm making those value corrections I was talking, or not value corrections, form corrections, because I took a hard look at the shapes and everything again, and I discovered that my shapes are kind of in the wrong spot. So you can see I'm kind of extending down that tree to try to make it a little bit more distinct. Because you'll find it when you're getting consumed with the detail of things that you have a habit of putting all of your shapes and all of your like different things kind of in line with each other, and your mind just kind of unconsciously will line things up, which is something you really want to avoid. You can see here I was kind of spending a little bit of time going back into my palette. I'm going to be blending out the house. And this house is a bit tricky because the house in real life is kind of like a red, and it's also pretty dark. And at least I find when I look at red things, their shadows are really, really deep. And yeah, as the camera perceives this, it's like a pure solid black, but I really don't want a solid black that far back in the painting. So that house is definitely going to be a trickier part of the composition that I'm not really sure how I want to handle yet. Throughout the course of this first layer, I'm basically going to have that back fence there, which is a little bit of a problem figured out. But that house is something I haven't really exactly figured out how I'm going to do yet. I think it's just going to come from intuitively kind of working it over a lot of different passes. Then I'm eventually going to get it to a state that I like it. So yeah, going in, softening out my shapes. It's always a good idea to soften things out. And now I'm getting started with the grass. And this grass is something that you can see I'm now using the paper towel and to really soften things out. And I want the grass, like as paint, to be very thin. So I'm going to be doing lots of scumbles and pushing that paint around. And I've kind of, one of the strange things I've always picked up on in painting, I don't know if anybody else has, because I've never really heard people talk about it. But when I look at a painting, I can really, really easily tell what areas are painted on top of each other. Like when you look at like a John Singer Sargent painting, one thing that I think is particularly captivating about his paintings is you can literally see like the order of strokes, brush strokes in which he articulated these portraits. And I found just looking at all paintings, you can see what paint is placed on top of each other. So having like an area like the grass, I like to keep the paint there very thin, because when you build up your subjects and when you work on your subjects more, they almost like are going to get sculpturally built out of the painting and look like they're standing out more. So it's kind of just a visual trick I learned to try to make kind of the things that you care about in the painting pop a bit more, because again, they have more paint built out, so they're popping out of the canvas literally, because paintings are kind of sculptural in that way. And this is going to unconsciously kind of draw people to what you want them to look at. Now I'm working on kind of the roof of that house in the back. And I always think roofs are an interesting subject in that they tell a lot about the way that a house is made. Like the house I've been working on recently, not the one of the painting, this is just kind of the construction work I've been doing. I think it's kind of interesting because the roof has like 3 different layers of shingles put on top of it, and it just seems like they just had like a ton of shingles, and it was like as many shingles they can put down, the better. So it's been pretty funny to work on. This specific roof I think is kind of interesting also because the person that lives in the house, his original plan for this roof was that he was going to have that kind of area that roof is covering right now exposed, and he was going to plant sunflower seeds. And the sunflowers were going to grow like vines up the side of the porch, and was going to kind of form a canopy of sunflowers, which he tried for a couple of years, but then he eventually gave up on it. So, and he put like a kind of aluminum roof over it, which is, I don't know, it feels like kind of like an admission of defeat in a way, which is a little bit sad, but it's kind of a reflection of, I feel like, a lot of these kind of suburban landscapes and home ownership. So yeah, the area I'm working in right now, I really should be using a bigger brush for what I'm doing, but I don't know. My brushes right now are pretty terrible. And this knife brush is so nice when you're using it, just because it has that, you can make those kind of lateral strokes and use that broad of the blade, and it deposits the paint so nicely. So it's just really nice to work with. So I don't really want to change brushes just because I like the handling of this brush. So it's going to take a little bit longer to work, but I feel like it's going to not affect things too badly, especially because I have this habit of softening things always. And especially when you're painting, you kind of find that it's really hard to think in paint, but you always have these kind of operating ideas and these compulsions. For me, for instance, it's softening. And that's kind of things that you stick to as you paint. Yeah. And now I'm going to be working on this kind of problem area again. And so I've been trying to kind of figure out kind of the scheme of light and shadow and temperature for this. And what I'm planning on doing in the painting right now is having kind of this idea where it's a kind of cold filtered light that's filtering through the painting. So because the area in light's going to be this cold filtered light where I'm going to have those really nice, beautiful teals, I'm going to want some variation in temperature. So this area over here, I'm really trying to emphasize kind of the warm tones over here. So something, just a general rule, is cold light casts warm shadows, warm light casts cold shadows. And so I'm really trying to emphasize just kind of how warm this area of the painting is to kind of get that idea of the streaming light over the painting. And now I'm kind of experimenting a little bit. Just, it's a little bit early to be doing kind of detail like this, especially since I haven't fully explained what that roof is going to look like yet. And I'm not really sure if I want to have some homage to the idea that they were going to have like a sunflower roof there or not. So I'm going to be probably doing that area a lot and thinking about that area a lot. But I'm just kind of futzing around with the details a little bit, just as a visual note that area is going to be kind of your peaking fruit trees. And now I'm kind of getting towards the end of the day, and by this point in the day, I'm pretty tired. And I found when I'm tired and at the end of the painting session, I have a predisposition to make a lot of mistakes. So I was kind of trying to mentally prepare myself for what I'm going to be doing. And during my break, I decided before the end of the day, I just wanted to really get that boat addressed, which is a pretty serious subject matter. And then I wanted to just basically just cover with light scumbles, which are really undamaging, so they're not going to do much bad. Everything else kind of in that middle area. So I'm taking the time to blend out the boats, the colors there. And again, it's all about that mental preparation. So now I'm getting started to paint that boat. And this is, again, a mistake. When I first started painting, it was all about time management. I was a student in school, had a lot of things going on. So I really had to manage my time. But I don't know, as I've gotten older, I just don't have the energy that I used to have. And now it's not so much time management, because I have tons of time, but it's all about energy management. Because by the end of the day, after painting, I'm just exhausted. So yeah, I try to do the areas that take a lot of thinking and are kind of dangerous and prone to more risk earlier in the day. And I try to do the areas that are much kind of easier towards the end. Yeah, I'm having a general indifference to the way I handled this boat, because it's just pretty okay. I've kind of done subjects like this, like in the painting I did not too long ago. I had this car, which was one of those types of things that was not dissimilar from this boat. And I was able to get that in one try, and I kind of had to like mentally prepare myself, and I was thinking about how I was going to do that car for a long time. And then I sat down and did the car, and I was really happy with myself because like my plan worked out and all that kind of stuff. Whereas I didn't really do that for this boat. Maybe I was a little confident just because I had recently done that painting of a car. And so I was a little bit cocky, thinking that I could handle this without playing it out. So I'm just kind of blocking things in, and it doesn't really get perfect. It's not really resolved all that well. But it's not the end of the world. I didn't do any damage. Well, I did a little bit of damage in that shadow shape there that I'm working in. I put this weird kind of really highly chromatic purple, which I was trying to kind of, or purple red, which I was trying to kind of get to express the fact that this is like a kind of synthetic plastic boat cover, and synthetic things kind of generally have those really polarizing colors in them. So I was trying to express that, and I don't think it works too well, but it's something that I was going for, and maybe I'll resolve it on a later level. I'm definitely going to have to resolve it, and it's not such a bad thing to have more layers of paint in a subject, just because, again, you can kind of tell which areas have been worked on more in a painting than areas that have not. So yeah, one thing that's I think is kind of interesting when working with synthetic materials is that they like visually blend differently from natural materials, and that like when they're kind of reflective, they will kind of have those gradients and transitions, but you'll also have these like strange kind of harder looking contours when you look at them. It's almost like when you're like looking at a gradient in low resolution and you get those like hard lines that show you the different blend of color. So that's something that I'm trying to express here. Unfortunately, like this is what was going on in my mind, is that it's a synthetic material, so it's going to have this effect, but it's also pretty far away. So you're not really going to be able to see it too well. So I have that hard kind of light line right there. And right now I have it and I'm kind of reinforcing and sharpening these up, but it is just so far away in the composition that I'm not really sure if that's something you're going to be able to perceive. So I'm going to go back into this boat and soften things up a lot. Yeah, and now I'm working in that kind of shadow. It's a good idea to try to keep your shadows as flat as possible, just because color, like with the shadows and how dark things are, they kind of recede in space, and you want your kind of lights to pop out of the painting. That's something that I learned when I was studying the Flemish indirect style of painting, is that they would basically put absolutely nothing in their shadows, and then they would put all of their paint in the light. And that's just because, like, again, painting is a sculptural thing. So you want certain areas to pop out of the painting more, like physically with the paint. And by doing that kind of on your subjects, or even within the subjects, on the light parts of the subject, your eye is going to kind of be pushed more towards those types of things. And now I'm working on the cast shadow of the boat. And again, I'm pretty exhausted at this point, so I'm not really getting too like fancy with what I'm doing. There's a bunch of like rigging and stuff under the boat, which I could, if I really wanted to, and I was feeling up for it, go for right now. But I'm tired. And yeah, it's not a good idea to try to do stuff like that where you could really, really kind of have some high consequences when you're exhausted. And it's kind of funny because it almost seems like they always happen at the end of a painting session. So I guess that's kind of your discipline as a painter, is learning when to stop and when not to make mistakes like that. So I'm just kind of softening things up, kind of trying to gently articulate those shadows, just so it's going to be very easy to push things and pull things. And also so that they're going to recede further back into space. Yeah. Keeping things soft, cleaning my brushes. Something to note is this entire painting session, the only time I put any actual Gamsol on my brush was right at the very end of the of my painting sessions. And so basically this day I took one long break in the afternoon to eat lunch. So that's the only time Gamsol actually touched my brush. So I'm trying to kind of keep things to be kind of just very dry right now. I don't want kind of that smearing effect that you get from the Gamsol. I'm trying to just kind of, because I find that the harder and the kind of more rigid your lower paintings are, it actually kind of makes it easier to paint on top of it. So if I would had everything be very fluid and very washy right now, it would be more difficult to paint on top of it. So I'm just scumbling that house in. And the nice thing about scumbling is it does preserve a lot of that texture of that underpainting. So it will kind of give you the impression of just more texture than you're actually kind of taking the time to work into. So it's a nice, easy way to get a texture in there. Something I think is very funny also working on this trailer is my grandfather thought it was very important to have his trailer be painted with the same can of paint as his house. So I think it's pretty funny, and part of the character of the landscape is that the trailer is the same color as the house. So I made sure to kind of not change any of the color, which is again where that scumbling came is. I was able to get the value differences by the underpainting, and I just kind of used the same brush on top, like in two different areas. Just kind of an homage to my grandfather and how he wanted to have a trailer that matched his house, which I think is kind of funny because I don't know, if I owned a trailer, the thought wouldn't cross my mind once to paint it the same color as my house. Yeah, because I never really thought about that kind of stuff. But painting is the color is something that's important to my painting. Sorry about that little noise a second ago also. I thought I had all my notifications turned off, but I guess that one slipped through. So thank you, Apple, for telling me how long I've been on my computer. Yeah, and really just trying to finish up that little area of the grass there. And softening out that tree. This is what I was talking about earlier, about how all that detail I put in the tree I'm eventually going to erase. And I'm just trying to kind of keep things soft, keep things flat. And yeah, it looks like I'm just about done with the painting session for the day. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And thank you for sitting with me and watching this painting session. Have a nice day.